You know, in the 21st century, a war of words doesn't really need ambassadors anymore. All it takes is an internet connection. And today we're going to dissect a perfect example of this. A huge diplomatic firestorm between the US and India that was kicked off by just one single controversial social media post.
Okay, so here's the absolute heart of the issue. On the exact same day, you have two totally different messages about India, both coming from the US president. On one hand, you've got this reposted rant that calls the country a hellhole. And on the other, a super formal statement calling it a great country with a very good friend at the top. I mean, talk about diplomatic whiplash.
So naturally, this brings up a huge question. How on earth is that even possible? How can two completely opposite statements come out of the same administration, just hours apart? All right, let's unpack the anatomy of this whole diplomatic mess.
Okay, to really get what happened, we've got to go back to the beginning, to the spark that lit the fuse. So what was actually in this post that caused such a massive uproar?
So the first thing you need to know is that this wasn't actually an original comment from President Trump himself. He was basically acting as a huge amplifier. He shared a transcript and a video from a podcast by the conservative commentator Michael Savage. And by doing that, he was pretty much endorsing the message and blasting it out to millions of his followers.
And wow, the language in this thing was explosive. The transcript literally called Indian and Chinese immigrants gangsters with laptops who've stepped on our flag. I mean, this wasn't some subtle diplomatic critique. This was raw, unfiltered, and designed to provoke a reaction. Now, this whole rant didn't just come out of thin air. It was plugged right into this really heated debate in the US about birthright citizenship. You know, the idea that if you're born in a country, you're automatically a citizen. The podcast was claiming that people from India and China were coming over just to take advantage of this. And it also pushed this totally false claim that the US is the only country in the world with birthright citizenship. The reality? Nope, not even close. Around 36 countries have it, including our neighbors, Canada and Mexico.
Well, as you can probably guess, the backlash was instant, and the damage control operation kicked into high gear just as fast. The U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, responding to the Indian media, scrambled to put out a very different kind of statement from the president.
And boom, just like that, the entire narrative gets flipped on its head. In just a matter of hours, we went from hellhole to heaps of praise. The message couldn't have been cleared. Hey, forget that other thing you saw. This is the real official position. It was a classic, by-the-book diplomatic cleanup.
So, how did the Indian government react to this diplomatic mess? Well, their response wasn't some knee-jerk, angry reaction. Nope, it was actually a really careful, very deliberate, two-step process of pushing back.
Okay, so at first, India's Ministry of External Affairs, the MEA, played it super cool. Their spokesperson gave this masterclass in just brushing it off. They basically said, "We've seen some reports, and that's all we're going to say." But then, just a few hours later, right after the U.S. Embassy did its cleanup act, the MEA came back with a much sharper and more formal statement.
And in this second statement, well, the gloves came off. Now, they never mentioned President Trump by name, but the criticism was sharp and it was crystal clear. They called the remarks uninformed, inappropriate, and in poor taste. Now, that might sound kind of mild to you and me, but trust me, in the very careful, coded world of diplomacy, that is a serious smackdown.
But India did something else here that was really strategic. The MEA made sure to add that these comments certainly do not reflect the reality of the India-US relationship. See what they did there? It was a very deliberate move to separate one person's impulsive comment from the much bigger long-term partnership. Basically, they were building a firewall to protect the alliance.
And you know, this whole incident, it really shines a spotlight on a much bigger theme, which is this constant push and pull, this back and forth dynamic that pretty much defined the entire relationship between the two leaders.
So on one hand, you had this very public, very visible display of what everyone called good personal chemistry. You know, President Trump was always calling Prime Minister Modi a great friend. They'd have these wonderful birthday phone calls, and they were constantly praising each other's big policy achievements.
But then, on the other hand, just below that friendly surface, that personal rapport was always smashing up against some serious policy friction. All the warmth of a friendly phone call could be completely erased by threats of massive tariffs, especially when it came to things like trade or India's involvement with the BRICS countries. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
And look, this whole hellhole comment wasn't just a one-time slip-up. It was part of a pattern. Take this quote from a 2020 presidential debate.
Criticizing India, especially on environmental stuff, became a bit of a recurring theme, and it often involved lumping India in with geopolitical rivals like China and Russia. So what's going on here? Why all the contradictions? Well, to really get to the bottom of it, we need to zoom out and take a look at the bigger picture, the administration's entire philosophy on foreign policy. And at the very heart of it all was the America First doctrine. When you talk to policy analysts, they'll tell you this is basically a worldview that sees the entire international system as being kind of rigged against the United States. It's an approach where you prioritize immediate, specific American interests way above things like traditional alliances or global cooperation.
Now, this policy has a few key characteristics. For one, it's super transactional. Every relationship is judged by what's in it for the U.S. It's also deeply personal, which means that chemistry between leaders becomes way more important than it used to be. And finally, it's not afraid to use economic muscle, like throwing around tariffs to force the hands of both enemies and allies.
So if you're a country like India, trying to navigate this world is like walking a diplomatic tightrope. On one side, you have to keep that personal relationship with the leader going strong, but at the exact same time, you have to be ready for a sudden policy whiplash or, like we just saw, some really explosive public comments.
So what does this all boil down to? Well, for one, we learned that friendly handshakes and personal chemistry between leaders don't mean you're going to have a smooth ride on policy. We also saw that social media isn't just background noise. It's a real, unpredictable minefield in modern diplomacy. And ultimately, this whole episode is a perfect case study of how an America First policy can leave even your closest partners feeling like they're walking on eggshells, in a world where the rules can literally change with a single post. It's the new, unpredictable reality of how countries deal with each other now. And all of this leaves us with one last, big question to think about. In this era where politics and diplomacy feel so personal, what actually defines an alliance anymore? Is it the friendly phone call between two leaders, or is it the cold, hard reality of a punitive tariff? That's a question that countries all over the globe are still wrestling with.